I used to think gold in rivers was just luck. You see a photo online, someone holding a chunky nugget, water dripping off it, and it feels like the river just handed it over. Like treasure simply appears if you stand in the right place at the right time. Then I started paying attention to what rivers actually do. And the more I looked, the more it hit me. A river isn't a random place where gold happens to be. A river is a machine, a patient, stubborn, physics-driven machine that can hide gold for thousands of years and then reveal it like it was planted yesterday. That sounds dramatic, but it's real, and it's one of the coolest things about nature. Because gold has a weird personality. Gold doesn't rust, it doesn't dissolve easily, it doesn't break down like softer rock, and it's heavy, ridiculously heavy. Gold's density is about 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter. That one number explains a lot of the mystery because most of what a river carries, quartz, granite fragments, sand, sits closer to 2.6 to 3. In river terms, gold isn't just a little heavier, it's in a different league. So when water moves a mix of sand, gravel, and heavy minerals, the river is constantly making choices. Not conscious choices, energy choices. Fast water can carry more, slow water must drop things. And when the river drops things, it drops the heavy stuff first. That's not a theory. That's the rule. Here's the part that most people miss. Rivers don't just move material downstream. Rivers also store material. They cache it, they bury it, they protect it under new layers like a time capsule. If you've ever stood on a riverbank and noticed it looks like a layer cake, soil on top, then sand, then gravel, then sometimes a darker band near the bottom, that's the river showing you its memory. Those layers are history, flood history, channel history, and sometimes gold history. I'll give you a picture that made it click for me. Imagine the river during a flood. The water rises, it speeds up, it has power, it tears into banks, it picks up gravel, it mobilizes everything. That's when gold can actually move. Not far usually, more like hop, settle, hop again, but it can move. Then the flood fades. The river loses energy. And now it has a problem. It's holding too much weight, so it starts letting go. First it drops big rocks, then coarse gravel, then sand. And somewhere in that process, almost always near the bottom, in the places that are hardest to disturb again, the heavy minerals concentrate. Black sand, magnetite, dense grains, and mixed in with that, gold. Not everywhere, not evenly, but where the river's energy drops in the right way. And that's why I don't love the word luck when people talk about golden rivers. Luck makes it sound like chaos. Rivers aren't chaos. Rivers are patterns. The real question becomes, if gold is so heavy and so stable, how does a river hide it for thousands of years? It hides it the same way nature hides anything valuable, by covering it with ordinary stuff. A river can bury a gold-bearing layer under fresh sand after one storm. Then after the next storm, it might bury it again. Then plants grow, soil forms, the surface looks normal. You could walk right over it and never realize there's a dense, dark layer underneath that hasn't been touched since before your town existed. And that's the part that feels almost unfair, because the river doesn't announce it, it doesn't label the spot, it just stacks material according to physics and time. I'm speaking from experience here. I've stood in places that looked identical, same gravel, same water clarity, same bend in the creek, and one had heavy mineral streaks and that sticky, dense sand feel, and the other was basically empty, same river, different memory. When you understand that rivers have memory, you start looking for evidence of that memory. You start caring about where the river slows down, where it accelerates, where it scours, where it deposits. You start noticing the shape of the channel, like it's a story being written in real time. And you start realizing there are two rivers you're dealing with. The river you see today and the river that existed during the big events. The floods, the channel shifts, the cutbanks collapsing, the years where the river rewrote the landscape. Gold tends to move during the rewriting. Gold tends to hide during the quiet years. So the hiding mechanism isn't magic, it's storage. And storage happens in traps. Natural traps that keep getting refilled the same way a savings jar keeps collecting spare change. Inside bends where the water slows. Behind boulders where the flow creates a calm pocket. In cracks in bedrock where heavy stuff drops and becomes almost impossible to lift out again. At transitions, riffle into pool, where the river changes gears and heavy material falls out like a suitcase dropped at the station. If you've ever watched water swirl behind a rock and seen fine sand dance while heavier grains settle almost immediately, you've watched the river sort a miniature version of an entire valley. That sorting is the beginning of hiding, because once heavy material drops into a protected spot, the river often seals it with a lid, a fresh layer of lighter sand and gravel. That lid can last a season, or a decade, or far longer if the channel moves away. And that's where the thousands of years part becomes real. Rivers migrate. They don't stay perfectly centered forever. They slide sideways across their valleys. They cut new paths. They abandon old paths. And when they abandon a path, whatever was stored there can get buried and preserved like a closed vault. There are places in the U.S. where old river gravels sit up on benches above modern water. Terraces that are literally older versions of the river sitting higher than today's channel. That's not just a pretty landscape feature. That's evidence that the river used to run there. That means sorting happened there. Storage happened there. Sometimes the modern river cuts back into those old gravels and re-releases what was stored. That's when a short stretch of creek suddenly feels rich, like something got turned on. And if you've ever seen a bank collapse after high water, fresh raw layers exposed, darker gravel bands suddenly visible, you've seen the river open a window into its own archive. That archive is what hides gold. Not a single secret spot, not a single lucky bend. A whole system of sorting, trapping, sealing, and time. And once you see it that way, the river stops being a place you search randomly. It becomes a place you read. Because the gold isn't the only thing hiding. The river's history is hiding too. And the history is what leads you to the gold. Gold can't hide in a river without the river doing one thing extremely well: sorting. And I mean sorting in a brutally simple way, like a machine that doesn't care what you want. It only cares about energy. If the current has enough energy, it carries material. If it doesn't, it drops material. And because gold is so dense, it gets dropped early and often. That's why the best way to understand hidden gold isn't to start with gold at all. It's to start with how rivers move sediment. A river is always trying to balance two jobs at the same time. It wants to move water downhill, and it wants to move the weight that water picks up. But it can't always do both. When the river speeds up, it gains the ability to carry heavier stuff. When it slows down, it loses that ability, and it has to unload. That unload is where the treasure begins. Think about a river bend. Water doesn't move evenly around a curve. The outside of the bend is faster and more aggressive. The inside is slower and calmer. So the outside bank gets eaten away, and the inside bank becomes a drop zone. That's not a gold tip. That's basic physics. Now take that idea and apply it to everything a river does. When the river hits an obstacle, like a boulder, it creates turbulence. Right behind the rock, you get a protected pocket where the water has less power. Heavy grains drop into that pocket. Then the next event drops more. Then the next. It's like a little natural savings account. And if you're lucky enough to have bedrock exposed in the channel, that's where things get serious. Because bedrock cracks are not just low-energy pockets. They're physical traps. A crack is a slot where heavy material can fall into and become sheltered from the main current. Once a crack is packed with dense grains, it can take a major flood to clean it out. That's why bedrock reaches have a reputation for holding gold. Not because they make gold, because they're one of the few places in a river that can hold heavy stuff in place for a long time. And here's something I wish more people understood. Gold doesn't need to travel far to become concentrated. A gold flake might move inches at a time during a high water pulse. It might roll, hop, settle, then get buried. Then months later, another event disturbs the gravel and it hops again. So the idea of gold migrating down a river like a leaf floating downstream is misleading. Gold travels like a heavy suitcase being dragged across a crowded floor, slow, jerky, and always trying to settle. That's why gold ends up where the river repeatedly loses energy. And rivers lose energy in predictable places. One of the clearest examples is the transition from a riffle into a pool. Over a riffle, the channel is shallow. Water is fast and chaotic. The river is doing work, moving gravel, scouring the bed, stirring everything up. Then the channel deepens into a pool. The flow slows. The water has less ability to carry weight, so heavy material drops out right at that change. It's like the river changing gears, and every time it changes gears, it sorts. This is where the dark layer idea becomes real. When a river sorts material, it doesn't just separate by size, it separates by density too. Dense minerals, magnetite, hematite, other heavy grains, collect together. That's black sand. Gold often rides with that crowd because it's playing the same game. Density. So black sand isn't proof of gold, but it's proof of sorting. It tells you the river has been doing the kind of work that can hide heavy material in the first place. Now let's talk about how hiding actually happens, because sorting alone doesn't create thousands of years. Sorting is the selection, hiding is the storage. Storage happens when a river deposits a heavy layer and then seals it. Picture a flood event. During peak flow, the river has power. It can move big gravel. It can tear into banks. It can shift a bar. It can expose bedrock. Then the flood starts to drop. As flow decreases, the river loses carrying capacity. It starts dropping the heaviest material first, often right down near the bottom of the gravel stack. Then as energy keeps falling, it drops lighter gravel and sand on top. So you can end up with a dense layer near the base, capped by lighter stuff. And that cap matters, because that cap protects what's underneath from being disturbed during normal flow. In other words, the river hides gold by burying it under ordinary-looking gravel. If you've ever dug into a gravel bar and noticed the deeper material suddenly turns darker, heavier, and stickier, you know what I mean. The surface might be pale, loose gravel, but underneath the deposit changes. It can become compact, dense, dark. That's not just dirt. That's a record of past energy. And in many systems, the richest concentration is right where the river meets a hard floor. Bedrock, clay, or a compact layer that acts like a barrier. Because dense material keeps sinking until it can't sink anymore. That's why people talk about pay streaks at the bottom. Again, not luck. Gravity. Now here's the part that connects directly to thousands of years. If the river keeps flowing in the same place, it might rework that bar and mix layers again. It might uncover the heavy layer and move some of it. It might bury it deeper. But rivers don't stay still. They migrate sideways, they build new bars, they abandon old ones. And when a channel shifts away from a deposit, that deposit stops being reworked. It can get preserved. It can get covered by silt from floodplains. It can get colonized by vegetation. It can become soil. From the surface, it can look like just another flat bench or a quiet slope. But underground, the old gravel and heavy layers can remain almost untouched. That's how you get a river hiding gold for thousands of years. Not by locking it in a safe, by building a layered deposit, moving away, and letting time seal it shut. And the wild part is, the river can come back. Modern flow can cut into old deposits. Bank erosion can expose older gravels. A flood can rip open a terrace edge. That's when hidden gold becomes visible again, and people think the river made it. It didn't. It stored it. And the difference between stored and made is the difference between guessing and understanding. Because once you grasp that storage exists, the landscape starts to look different. A flat terrace isn't just a pretty place to walk. It's a clue. A cut bank isn't just erosion. It's a cross-section of the river's memory. A dark band isn't just dirty gravel. It's the river showing you where heavy things settled when the water lost power. And once you see those clues, the next question becomes unavoidable. If rivers can store gold in old deposits, what makes those old deposits get preserved in the first place? Why do some deposits survive while others get erased and reworked? That's where time, river migration, and abandoned channels enter the story in a big way. What makes a river capable of hiding gold for thousands of years isn't the gold itself. It's the fact that rivers don't just move forward. They move sideways. They move downward, and sometimes they move away entirely. And when a river moves away, it can leave behind a deposit that stops getting disturbed, like turning off the blender and letting everything settle, then walking away while a lid slowly forms on top. That's how a hidden deposit is born. If you've ever looked at an aerial photo of a river in the U.S., anything from a small Appalachian creek to a bigger western river, you've seen it. The channel snakes. It shifts. It redraws itself. That snaking isn't decorative. It's the river trying to solve a physics problem. Move water downhill while dealing with whatever sediment it's carrying. On a curve, the outside bank is usually the attack zone. The current hits harder, scours deeper, and chews the bank. On the inside of that same curve, the river slows down and drops material. So the bend migrates, not a little. Over long time frames, it can migrate enough that what used to be the active channel becomes dry ground. That's the first way rivers hide gold. They abandon their own best traps, because the places that concentrate heavy material, inside bends, bar heads, protected pockets, don't disappear when the channel moves. The deposits remain. They just stop being reworked. Now imagine what happens after that. The abandoned channel area becomes quiet. During high water, floods spill out of the main channel and lay down fine sand and silt across the floodplain. Vegetation grows and traps even more sediment. Organic material builds. Soil forms. Little by little, the old gravel gets buried under layers that look completely ordinary. And that's the moment people underestimate. A preserved deposit doesn't look like treasure. It looks like nothing. It can look like a flat bench, a low terrace, a gentle slope with scrub and grass. But beneath that calm surface can be old river gravel, the kind that only forms under moving water. And at the base of that gravel can be a dense layer the river built when it was still active. This is where the landscape starts to become a clue system. In a lot of American river valleys, you'll see terraces, those step-like benches above the current channel. They're basically the river's old floors, stranded higher because the river later cut down to a lower level. When you see a terrace, you're looking at proof that the river used to run at that height. And if a river used to run there, it used to sort there. So terraces are not just scenery, they're history. And some of the most productive it-came-out-of-nowhere moments happen when a modern river starts chewing into one of those older deposits, either by migrating sideways into the terrace edge or by cutting deeper and intersecting older gravel layers. Here's the part that feels almost like a plot twist. Rivers don't just hide gold once. They can hide it, then uncover it, then hide it again. A deposit can be built during an active phase, buried when the channel shifts, then partially exposed later when the river returns to that side of the valley. A flood can undercut a bank, a chunk collapses, and suddenly older gravels are back in play. That's when you get those short, hot stretches, a few yards or a few hundred yards where heavy material suddenly shows up more often. To someone who isn't thinking in layers, it looks like luck or a miracle. To someone who is thinking in layers, it looks like the river opening a window into its own archive. And you can actually see it sometimes. If a cut bank is fresh, especially after high water, you might notice the bank face looks like a slice, topsoil, then fine sand, then older gravels below. Sometimes you even see a darker band near the base. That darker band isn't automatically gold, but it's often a sign of dense mineral concentration, the same sorting behavior that gold follows. And when a bank collapses, those older rounded gravels can spill into the channel and get resorted by modern flow. That's the recycling effect. Gold that was stored in a quiet deposit gets released, moves a short distance, then drops into today's traps, behind rocks, into bedrock cracks, at riffle-to-pool transitions. Because the modern river is still a sorting machine. It's just sorting old material instead of new. This is where my personal perspective really changed, because it forced me to stop thinking like a treasure hunter and start thinking like a river. I stopped asking, where do people find gold? And started asking, where would a river preserve something heavy and then later cut back into it? That question points your eyes toward the same set of features over and over. Benches above the river that look unnaturally flat, old rounded gravel sitting higher than current water level cut banks, exposing layered sediment zones where the river is actively undercutting and collapsing banks. Short stretches where bedrock shows up in cracks can act like storage. It also explains why two spots can look similar on the surface and behave totally differently underneath. Because one spot is just modern gravel being reworked constantly, and the other spot is modern flow intersecting old storage, an older deposit that's been sitting there, sealed, while decades turned into centuries. That's how rivers hide gold for thousands of years. They sort it, store it, seal it, and then, when the valley shifts or the river migrates, sometimes they accidentally reveal it again. And once you accept that rivers have a buried past, one last question becomes the most practical one of all. If the river's past is what matters, what are the cleanest, most convincing signs, right in front of your eyes, that you're looking at preserved river history instead of just ordinary ground? The best part is that you don't need a lab or a geology degree to see a river's history. Rivers leave receipts. They write their past into the landscape in a way that's surprisingly readable, if you know what you're looking at. And when you start looking for those receipts, you stop treating a river like a single line of water. You start treating it like a corridor, a living channel today, plus a whole neighborhood of older channels, older deposits, and older surfaces sitting beside it. The first receipt is shape. A modern river almost never sits perfectly centered in a valley forever. It slides back and forth, slowly eating one side and building the other. If you stand on a high point and look down, you can sometimes see the pattern, a series of gentle arcs, abandoned swales, subtle curves that don't match the active channel. Those shapes are not random. They're scars from older paths. In some valleys, you can even spot pale, curved lines in vegetation, where moisture behaves differently because the ground beneath is different. An old channel filled with finer sediment can hold water in a way that the surrounding gravels don't. It shows up as a different shade of green, a different texture, a different kind of growth. It's a quiet clue, but it's real. The second receipt is elevation. If you see a flat bench above the current river, a terrace, what you're seeing is the river's old floor, stranded above the modern channel because the river later cut deeper. Terraces are one of the clearest signals that you're standing on preserved river history. And here's where it becomes directly connected to gold. Terraces often contain old river gravels, and old river gravels exist because water once flowed there long enough to round and sort them. The river did work there. That work can include concentrating heavy material. So terraces are not gold spots, but they are proof the river system had an older operating level and older deposits. The third receipt is the rock itself. Old river gravel looks different from random hillside rubble. It's rounded. It's worn. It often has a mix of sizes, a mix of rock types, and it tends to look like it's been handled by moving water for a long time. If you find rounded cobbles sitting far above the current waterline, that's not normal mountain debris. That's a river signature, and rivers don't carry rounded gravel up onto hills. So when you see it up there, you're seeing evidence of a different channel position in the past. The fourth receipt is the bank cross-section. This is where a river can show you its memory like a literal page you can read. A cutbank is a natural road cut. It exposes layers, topsoil on top because that's what grows on the surface. Below that, often finer sand or silt from floodplain deposits. Below that, gravels, sometimes very clean, well-rounded gravels. And sometimes, near the base, a darker band, material that looks denser, heavier, more compact. In a lot of placer systems, the most interesting material sits low in the gravel stack because heavy stuff keeps trying to sink until it hits something that stops it. Clay, compacted layers, bedrock. That's why you hear people talk about pay being down low. Again, not romance. Gravity. Now, even if you never touch a shovel, you can still learn something from the color and texture of layers in a bank. A distinct gravel layer beneath finer sediment suggests an older channel deposit. A darker band can suggest a concentration of dense minerals. And if the river is actively chewing into that bank, and especially after high water, that's when older material can get released back into the modern flow. That's the moment hidden gold becomes available again. The fifth receipt is behavior, how the river acts in certain stretches. Rivers expose old deposits where they do intense work, undercutting, scouring, collapsing banks, digging into terrace edges, cutting into the toes of slopes. So when you see a reach where the river is aggressively eating one side of the valley, That's not just erosion. That's excavation. It's the river doing free mining. And what it excavates can include older gravels that haven't been touched in a long time. This is also why big storms matter. A flood isn't just more water. A flood is a different river. It has different power, different capacity, and it can carve into banks that normally hold steady. It can open fresh exposures, fresh windows into old layers. Then when the water drops, the river immediately goes back to sorting mode. It starts dropping heavy stuff into today's traps. So the sequence becomes almost predictable. High water opens the archive, low water sorts the release. That's a really useful way to think about it because it connects the long-term story with what you actually see on a normal day. You're watching a system that stores and releases, over and over across time. Now there's one more piece that makes this feel truly thousands of years instead of just last season. A lot of preserved deposits don't sit only a few feet above the river. Some sit far enough above the modern channel that the landscape has had time to change. Soil development, vegetation maturity, even entire ecosystems stabilizing on top of old gravels. That's when you realize you could be standing on a deposit that hasn't been disturbed since long before modern development in the area, sometimes long before recorded local history. And that's why rivers are such effective hiders. They don't need a vault door. They just need time and a steady habit of burying heavy things under ordinary things. So if rivers leave receipts, shape, elevation, rounded gravels, bank layers, and aggressive erosion, there's a natural next step. How do you combine those receipts into one clean mental model so you're not just noticing clues, but actually understanding what they mean together? When you put all those receipts together, the river stops looking like a single channel and starts looking like a system with layers, almost like a city built on top of older cities. And this is where I think a lot of people get frustrated because they're trying to solve a 3D problem with a 2D mindset. They stand at the water's edge and scan the surface gravel like the answer has to be sitting right there. But rivers hide gold by doing something very simple and very effective. They put the heavy stuff where it belongs, low and protected, then they cover it with everything else. So the cleanest mental model is this. There's the active river doing work right now, and there are older deposits sitting beside it and above it, waiting to be intersected again. The river isn't a line, it's a timeline. Once you start thinking like that, you can organize the clues into a pattern that actually makes sense. One, you look for places where old river surfaces are preserved. That's your terraces, those flat benches above the current channel. They're basically the river's old floors. And terraces matter because they tell you the river used to run higher, which means the river used to sort higher, which means heavy material could have been concentrated in those older gravels. Even if there's no gold there, terraces tell you the system has a history long enough to store something. Two, you look for evidence that those old surfaces include true river gravel, rounded stones, mixed sizes, mixed rock types, worn edges. If it looks like a river carried it, a river probably did. And the more river-worn the gravel looks, the more confident you can be that you're not staring at random hillside rubble. 3, you look for places where the modern river is actively cutting into that history. This is the big one, because storage doesn't help you if it stays sealed forever. The moments that create those "how is this possible" finds usually happen where the modern channel is undercutting a bank, chewing into a terrace edge, or exposing older layers in a cutbank. If the river is excavating, it's doing the hard work of opening the archive, and you can literally watch the process. A fresh bank face appears. Older rounded gravels show up beneath finer sediment. Sometimes you see darker, denser bands. Then, during and after high water, chunks slump into the channel. And once that older material enters the modern flow, the river does what it always does. It sorts. It drops heavy material into today's traps. That brings up the fourth piece of the model. Modern traps are still king. Even when an old deposit is being released, you still need a place where heavy material can settle. Inside bends, behind boulders, bedrock cracks, riffle-to-pool transitions. Those are the spots where released heavy material gets restacked in a way that can be found again. So the picture becomes a loop. Old deposit gets exposed. Heavy material is released. Modern river resorts it. It drops into modern traps. It gets buried again. And the loop can repeat many times in the same short reach. That's why one short stretch can feel alive, and the next stretch feels dead. Because the loop is only running in one place. Now I want to talk about one more thing that sounds small, but it's actually a huge clue. The feel of the material. Dense material behaves differently. If you've ever handled black sand or dense concentrates, you know there's a weight to it that normal sand doesn't have. It packs differently. It settles differently. It's not fluffy. I'm not saying that sensation is scientific proof, but it's consistent with the physics we've been talking about. Density concentrates where energy drops. That's why black sand shows up in the same kinds of traps that gold likes. Again, black sand doesn't guarantee gold, but it does prove the river has been sorting dense minerals, meaning the system can hide heavy things. And here's a reality check that helps this stay scientific instead of wishful. A river can only store what exists in its system. If there's no upstream source of gold in the broader region, you're not going to find meaningful gold just because you found a terrace. The storage model doesn't create gold. It only explains how gold, once present, can be concentrated and preserved. So the most honest way to say it is this. Rivers are excellent at hiding heavy material, but they only hide what the landscape provides. When you keep that in mind, the story becomes less about treasure hunting and more about reading evidence. And once you can read evidence, it stops being mystical. It becomes understandable. And that's the whole point of this topic. Because when you understand the mechanism, sorting, trapping, sealing, channel migration, preservation, you stop chasing random gravel. You start recognizing when the river is showing you its past. There's one last step that makes this feel complete, because it ties the long-term story back to what you can take away and remember in one clean idea, something that stays in your head the next time you stand next to moving water. A river hides gold for thousands of years the same way it hides anything heavy. It puts it where the flow can't easily reach it, then it covers it with ordinary material, and then it moves on. That's the simplest summary that still stays true. Gold is dense enough that it wants to sink to the lowest, most protected part of a deposit. Rivers help it do that by sorting. Then rivers help it stay hidden by sealing it under layers of gravel, sand, silt, and eventually soil. And time does the rest. Over decades, a bar becomes a bench. Over centuries, a bench becomes a terrace. Over longer stretches of time, an old channel becomes just another part of the valley, quiet, green, and completely unremarkable from the surface. But the deposit underneath doesn't stop being a deposit just because the surface looks normal. That's why a river can feel like it's making gold when it suddenly produces a hot stretch. What's really happening is much more logical and honestly much more impressive. The river is revisiting its own storage. It cuts into an older layer. A bank collapses. A terrace edge gets undercut. A flood opens a fresh face of gravel you didn't see last season. And the moment that older material enters the modern channel, the river flips back into its usual mode, sorting again, dropping heavy material into today's traps. So the miracle isn't a miracle. It's an overlap. Modern flow intersecting old history. That overlap is why two spots can look similar, but behave completely differently. One spot is just modern gravel being constantly mixed and reset. The other spot is modern flow hitting preserved storage, material that had time to settle, concentrate, and stay sealed. Once you see rivers that way, a lot of things become clearer. Terraces stop being scenery. They're evidence of an older river level. Rounded gravels above the waterline stop being random rocks. They're proof water once ran there. Cutbanks stop being just erosion. They're cross-sections of the river's memory. Dark, heavy bands stop being dirty gravel. They're the river showing you where dense material settled when energy dropped. And the biggest mindset shift is this. Gold in a river isn't random. It's historical. It's not only about where the river is today, it's about where the river used to be and where it cut back into what it left behind. That's the reason rivers can hide gold for thousands of years and still give it back in a single season. If you take one thing from this, take this. When you're standing next to a river, You're not looking at one river, you're looking at a timeline. And the best gold comes from the places where that timeline gets exposed.